So the idea behind attention restoration theory is that if you can find environments that don't place a lot of demands on directed attention while simultaneously having interesting stimulation to activate involuntary attention, you can sort of restore or replenish this precious directed attention resource. And we think that natural environments are one kind of environment that can do this. Maybe nature is kind of like exercise and vegetables. Like even if you don't like it, you should do it.
Hey folks, thanks for checking out the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. We're back with a new episode with a really fascinating guest, Dr. Marc Berman, who runs the Environmental Neuroscience Lab at the University of Chicago, which studies how the physical environment affects the brain and behavior. You've probably heard Marc's name before, as he has become the go-to expert over the last few years when it comes to understanding how time in nature can improve our cognitive capabilities. We've linked a few of those articles in the show notes. This was an especially interesting chat, as Marc actually came to nature through education, through research with Dr. Steve Kaplan, who specialized in environmental psychology, while Marc was a student at the University of Michigan. In the episode, we talk about some of the psychological and cognitive benefits of interacting with nature, the difference between voluntary and involuntary attention, the type of natural experiences that are beneficial, spoiler, they can be as simple as your local park, and how some of these benefits can be derived by simply looking at pictures of nature. We also talk about an amazing app that Marc has been working on. If you happen to be a software developer or in the tech world, make sure to listen to the end. You might be able to help. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Dr. Marc Berman. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to have Dr. Marc Berman, Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of the Environmental Neuroscience Lab at the University of Chicago. Thanks for joining us today, Marc.
Thanks for having me.
We ask our guests the same first question, and it kind of sets up how we work through the rest of your work. How do you define your relationship with nature?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and complicated relationship. I mean, one thing that I kind of joke with people is that it's not like I'm a person that goes mountain climbing or backpacking through nature, even though I think that stuff is really cool. I think I kind of realized the importance of nature maybe a little bit later, and in part from taking a course with Dr. Steve Kaplan, who is like the grandfather of a lot of this environmental psychology research. And I took a class with him and he talked about attention restoration theory and how different environments can sort of deplete or restore our attentional abilities, and that natural environments can be an environment that could be really restorative to people's attention, and that if people could do simple things like interacting more with nature, it could have a myriad of benefits, all these different kind of benefits, from attention to self-control, creativity, having better personal relationships. And I just found that idea to be really fascinating, and it really resonated with me. And I think I kind of had an intuition that the environment around us had a big impact on our behavior. And what Steve was suggesting was kind of in line with that, but also suggesting specifically the power of the natural environment to be really salubrious for human psychological functioning. So I just found that to be really, really fascinating, and I've kind of been studying those topics ever since.
Fantastic. And for our listeners, salubrious. What do you mean by salubrious? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so, in our work, we find that when people interact with nature, they improve their attention and memory by about 20%. And I think when people think about attention, maybe it seems kind of boring, but when we talk about attention, I think it's actually pretty fascinating, because attention really underlies so many psychological processes. So humans kind of have this unique ability to direct what they're paying attention to, unlike many other species where they're sort of more stimulus driven. So attention is more driven by loud noises, bright lights, food, things like that. Humans can kind of sort of suppress some of those things and sort of attend to things that they kind of want to intrinsically pay attention to. And it's kind of like a sort of like a human superpower, our ability to do this, but we can't do it forever. We become mentally fatigued and it's hard to pay attention. And I think we've all had that feeling or sensation after a long work day, or 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's really hard to focus. Or I see this a lot when I'm lecturing. I think I'm a pretty engaging lecturer, but 5 minutes into class, students are very attentive to what I'm saying. But 45 minutes into class, I see a lot of head nodding and people just having a hard time focusing. And we call that directed attention fatigue. That's a time when we need to take a break. And that's when we think sort of interacting with nature is a really good opportunity to sort of restore these abilities. So interacting with nature is salubrious because it improves our memory and attention. That's important for school and work. We even think that attention is related to our ability to sort of have self-control, like to maybe eat the apple instead of the piece of chocolate cake, or inhibit some knee-jerk aggressive response. So we think that nature helps with that, and that attention helps with that as well. So nature improves attention, which then improves self-control. We find that interacting with nature helps people with clinical depression. Interacting with nature helps people who are recovering from breast cancer. Interactions with nature are good for physical health. So it's just, there's a ton of benefits to interacting with nature. I think many people sort of focus maybe on the physical benefits. So, better air quality, which might lead to lower cardiovascular disease and things like that. And we focus on that, but we also focus on these psychological benefits, the ability of nature to help us concentrate better, focus better, to have more self-control.
So let's start a little bit at the beginning. You talked about stimuli. And one of the things that I found really interesting in your research is that natural stimuli is more restorative than man-made stimuli, sort of in urban environments, like a Times Square or something like that. So what do we know about how our brains react differently to sort of that organic natural stimuli versus the man-made stimuli?
Yeah, so there's a few things, and maybe I'll talk first a little bit about attention restoration theory, which is the theory that um, Steve Kaplan and his wife Rachel Kaplan sort of composed. So a key element to attention restoration theory is that humans have two main kinds of attention. So one kind of attention is this directed attention. Sometimes it's called voluntary attention, where you as an individual person are controlling what you're paying attention to. And that is what I was alluding to, is kind of like this maybe unique human ability. For example, you're paying attention and maybe your listeners are paying attention to what I'm saying, but there might be more interesting stimulation out in the environment that you could be paying attention to, but presumably you're deciding to pay attention to me. And that's great, but you really can only do that for so long before you become mentally fatigued, and it's hard to do that. This kind of directed attention ability is depletable or fatigable. You can only engage it for so long before you become mentally fatigued. That's different from another kind of attention that's called involuntary attention. Sometimes it's called bottom-up attention. So this is the kind of attention that's automatically captured by interesting stimulation in the environment. So loud noises, bright lights, those things automatically capture your attention and you don't have any control over it. And sometimes I do a kind of a silly example when I'm teaching my class. I'll be talking about this, and then all of a sudden I'll like slam my hand on a table, and everybody's attention immediately orients to me and where the sound was originating from. You don't have control over it. It's a very automatic, possibly, an older evolutionary mechanism. And it's thought that that kind of attention, this involuntary attention, is not really susceptible to fatigue or depletion, or at least less so than directed attention. You don't often hear people say, "Oh, I can't look at that beautiful waterfall anymore. It's too beautiful. It's too interesting. I'm just getting too tired." Or, "Oh, I can't watch this really interesting movie anymore. It's just too interesting. I have to take a break." So the idea behind attention restoration theory is that if you can find environments that don't place a lot of demands on directed attention while simultaneously having interesting stimulation to activate involuntary attention, you can sort of restore or replenish this precious directed attention resource. And we think that natural environments are one kind of environment that can do this. There's another important thing to mention too, which is how involuntary attention is sort of captured. So what kind of stimulation captures involuntary attention? And we talked about the stimulation needing to be softly fascinating. So what I mean by softly fascinating is that if you're out on a walk and, you see a river and ripples in the river, that can kind of automatically capture your attention. But you can kind of think or mind wander about other things. It doesn't really capture all of your attentional resources. If you're walking in Times Square, that's also going to be really super interesting, and your attention is going to be captured automatically by all the interesting stimulation in Times Square, but it's sort of more of a harsher attentional capture. It sort of captures all of your attentional resources and doesn't let go. And we think it's important that the stimulation be sort of softly fascinating to get these benefits rather than this kind of more harsh attentional capture. And again, we think that most natural environments have this property of not placing a lot of demands on directed attention while simultaneously having softly fascinating stimulation to capture involuntary attention. Sometimes when we submit papers, people can come up with some cheeky responses like, what if there's a wildfire? What if you're being chased by a bear? And of course, we don't think those are going to be restorative natural experiences. They're going to require a lot of directed attention. So the kind of natural experiences that I'm talking about are sort of going to your local park that's safe, not too crowded. You don't have to get worried about car traffic or things like that. You can just go in that environment and let your mind be automatically engaged by the stimulation in that environment.
So we all don't have to become Alex Honnold and go free solo a giant wall in Greenland or Yosemite to get this sort of benefit, it sounds like.
Again, I would think he's using a hell of a lot of directed attention to do that.
Okay, good. Good. We'll keep the bar low. So thinking about that bar, like what about things like listening to a soundtrack of ocean waves or rain, or maybe even just watching, I don't know, a nature documentary on Netflix or one that David Attenborough's narrating. Did these have similar cognitive benefits as actually being in the physical environments?
Yeah, we think they do. We've replicated a lot of these effects by having people look at pictures of nature versus pictures of urban scenes, listening to nature sounds versus urban sounds, watching videos of nature versus videos of urban scenes. So yes, that this kind of gets more interesting that there's something about the perceptual features of nature that maybe our brain more easily processes that might lead to these benefits. So for example, a lot of natural stimulation has what's called higher fractalness. So when you think about fractals, one example that's kind of common is if you have like a snowflake and the snowflake has a shape, if you had a microscope and you zoomed in on that snowflake, it would still have a similar characteristic shape. And if you zoomed in even more, it would still have this characteristic shape. So the snowflake shape is sort of scale free. It doesn't matter how zoomed in or zoomed out you look at it, it's got the same kind of shape. And natural stimulation tends to have a lot of these fractal properties, and urban stimulation tends to have less of these fractal properties. So it's possible that our brain sort of evolved to process that stimulation more easily, or it could be that actually that stimulation is just intrinsically easier to process. So that's something that we're kind of looking into now, is we're finding that actually pictures of natural scenes, if you do some kind of like JPEG compression, so you compress down the amount of bits of information in the scene and still kind of maintain a lot of the semantics of the scene, you know what it is. Actually, nature scenes get sort of compressed down more than urban scenes. So it's like nature scenes take up less room, less memory on your iPhone. Maybe they also take up less room in our brains. And maybe that's another reason why they sort of come with these benefits. Another thing that we're finding is that nature scenes, this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but nature scenes are more forgettable than urban scenes. So if you have people look at a bunch of nature and urban scenes and test them, like which ones did you remember, they don't remember the nature scenes as well as the urban scenes. And that might seem like a bad thing at first blush, but actually it might mean that it's because we just process that information more fluently, more easily. So it's sort of easier for us to process and we don't remember it. But the urban stimulation, we might be processing it more intensively, and then it might suck up a lot of directed attention and cognitive resources.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting, especially when you think about art in sort of landscapes and how soothing they can be for many people. And
Yes,
that idea that you're able to process it and it just feels like you're getting comfort from it by looking at those scenes,
yes,
even if they're not real, in the sense of
right.
like it's not a photo representation or a video representation. That's really fascinating.
And there were some artists, I think, in the 1950s who did this little project, like what's the world's most preferred art? And it tended to be for every country. It was sort of this kind of pristine nature theme that, we have this kind of intrinsic liking of nature. And I think that's led to a lot of theories, like the biophilia hypothesis, that humans have this sort of innate love of nature. And in modern times, we're sort of more divorced or separated from nature. And if we can then engage with nature more, we can sort of satisfy the sort of innate love we have of nature, which I think is interesting, but I think it's got to be more complicated than that. So just one thing at sort of a big level, it's like, well, if humans had such a love of nature, why do we destroy it so readily? And of course, it's complicated. There's economic things to consider and all these different things. But, that's one thing that always kind of bothered me a little bit. The other thing that's kind of interesting is we've done studies with children and we show them pictures of nature and urban scenes. And the idea would be if humans sort of have this innate love of nature, the kids would prefer the nature scenes. But we actually don't find that. We find that the kids actually prefer the urban scenes. And it's only as they get older do they prefer the nature scenes. So I don't think we should take it for granted that humans just inherently love nature. We think in many ways it's sort of a learned preference.
That's really interesting. I think there's been a little bit of a recent trend, at least it's come up through the media, of putting schools and more school activities outside and in nature. So is there a benefit, even though kids are more drawn to the urban scenes, is there a benefit to like having schools and having young people spend more time outside from a cognitive point of view?
Absolutely. And, it kind of, this gets at sort of some paternalistic stuff, maybe nature is kind of like exercise and vegetables. Like even if you don't like it, you should do it. And there is some element of that. And in some of our studies, we've had people go for walks in nature. These were studies done in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in June or July, it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and people really like walking in nature, and they show these really healthy cognitive benefits. We also had participants walk in January when it was like 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The participants did not like walking in nature, but they showed the same cognitive benefits as the people that walked in June or July. So you don't even have to like the nature interaction oftentimes to get these cognitive benefits. You do need to like it to get the mood benefits, but you don't need to like it to get the cognitive benefits. I think getting kids out in nature is fantastic. And I think the trick with these nature schools is trying to figure out like the control condition, so I'm an experimentalist. I want to not just do things on intuition. We need to know scientifically, is it really better? And so it's like, okay, nature school versus what? What's the other thing to compare it to? There's other things about nature schools that I'm not so sure. So for example, somebody once told me one time, doing school outside ruins both. So it ruins school because you can't concentrate on what the teacher's talking about because there's all this interesting stimulation outside. And it ruins the nature because you're trying to focus on the teacher when you really want to be enjoying the nature. So to me, I guess I don't have data on this, but my intuition is that I think nature schools are great if you use the nature as sort of a break from the classroom activity. So you do, the intensive classroom activity, and then you go out in nature and let the kids run around in nature as a break, and then you bring them back to the classroom to do the learning. Now, there's some things that you can learn really well in nature, things with ecology, but I'm not sure learning calculus in nature is
Yeah.
is is really the ideal environment.
Yeah, there may be limits, which is kind of a nice segue into our next question. So, are there limits to the benefits that we get from time spent in nature? Like, is there a point of decline where after you've spent 6 hours out in a beautiful forest, like, doesn't really benefit you that much incrementally anymore?
I think there's certainly it asymptotes. It has to. There are very few kind of processes where just more and more and more, and you keep getting the same amount of gain. I think it will asymptote. I think in modern times we have a lot of room to improve our attention. So I think anything we can get will help. And I think this is one thing where to be mindful. We think you'll get more bang for your buck if you take the nature break when you're most fatigued. So if you're feeling like your attention is really sharp and you're really able to concentrate, work. That's when you should be working. We wouldn't say go and take the nature break. Then it's kind of like when you're zoning out and you can't focus anymore, that's the time to take the nature break. And I think in our modern society, we're not at a point where it's like, oh, we're taking too many nature breaks. We're not getting the best. Like, no, people aren't taking nearly enough. We need more of it, and we need nature incorporated into our daily routine, incorporated into the infrastructure of our cities, incorporated in all of our buildings. Like, we want to be bringing more nature into our lives.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about is that you were working on an app called Retune. Is that
Yes.
still in progress? What's the idea
Yeah, we're
there?
still we're still working on it. We kind of need some help from if there were some software developers that we could find that could help us to kind of take it to the next level. The idea behind Retune, it was an acronym for Restoring Through Urban Natural Experiences. And it was an app that would sort of route you on the most restorative walking path between 2 points. So if you use Google Maps or Apple Navigation, it's going to find you the shortest path between 2 points. But what Retune does is it finds the walk that sort of exposes you to the most green space and trees, um, the least amount of sound, and also the least amount of crime. So it might lengthen your walk a little bit, but it increases the restorative we think that your walk will be. And so we have a version kind of working for Chicago, but it would be great if we could have a big user base to use it, have it throughout the whole country or throughout the world, and actually ask people, do you feel like it worked? Because right now we don't really know how to tune the parameters. I don't know really how to weight the green space versus the sound, for example. So I think there's a lot of potential there. We were trying to even get companies like Google kind of interested, but there are some complexities to it too. For example, you know, wealthier neighborhoods will have less crime, more green space, less sound. So this might bias where people walk into, wealthier neighborhoods or something like that. I guess I thought about it from another way, which is that I wanted to motivate people to think about this more on a daily basis. And I think if people thought about this more on a daily basis, they might demand having more green space in their neighborhoods.
That's fantastic. I love the idea of that. Maybe we have a software engineer listener, or at least some people who have connections to Google or something who can push to integrate this idea, because I think it's a really, really awesome one. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. This is a super interesting conversation, and I can't wait to share this episode because I think people are going to learn a lot and hopefully put it into practice in terms of spending more time in nature.
Well, thanks so much. It was my pleasure.